the grant. So it's very important to keep thinking about that. And for EU funding, the way that which funds are spent, the process is through different kinds of contracts. And we all are here talking about grant contracts, but we know that there are different types of contracts. And all of these contractual types are described in this thing called Prague. Basically, I think some of you really don't know what Prague is. Because for a grant contract, usually the key parts of Prague are incorporated into an implementation manual. So maybe you're provided, along with your grant contract, some training on how to implement the project, and you'll get some kind of a manual to help you. And usually the key aspects of Prague are incorporated into that manual. So for a lot of civil society organizations, they don't necessarily have to go to the direct source, which is Prague. But it's actually good to have a look at Prague and to understand what is in it and what the general principles of Prague are. The principles, and again, I keep stressing this thing about principles, because I think if you understand the principles, then everything else follows quite easily. And a lot of civil society organizations can't get their head around some of the principles. And the principle of Prague is basically that the EU money is public money. It's public funds. Civil society organizations are not set up to manage public funds. That's what governments do. And governments have structures to manage public funds. But NGOs, CSOs, are not set up for that purpose. So you don't have the structures in your organizations to manage it. But EU funds are public funds, and therefore spending that money should follow public procurement guidelines. And that's what Prague's all about. And it tries to ensure that the money is spent in an accountable way, in a transparent way, that you get the best value for the money being spent, and that you spend the money whenever there is any kind of tendering that is done through fair competition. There should be, because the EU believes in the free market, and it believes that free competition should be there. So these are the important principles behind Prague. 137 pages of lovely EU procedures. The guidelines is available everywhere. It's going to be on the Taxo resources page, but from your contracting authorities, wherever you can download Prague in lots of different places. And you should all have it. It should all be there as a reference. And you should look through it. You should look at what is in Prague. Not take it to bed with you and to read every page, because it's really dull. But to understand that when you need to know something, like the situation you gave is a perfect one, that you actually went to your contract, you went to the conditions, and the general conditions of the contract is from Prague. So you can go to Prague and you can find out and argue your case. Use it to support what you want to do. As we discussed earlier, you get this variation in how the guidelines are interpreted. But they are there to try to protect these principles. And I would hope that for most delegations, that if civil society organizations in good faith are trying to follow Prague, they should respect that and give, and if you argue a case and you present, they should respect that and allow you to continue. Instead. And here, this other point is, of course, because they are to do with procurement for people who don't have English as a native language or not so fluent, it's quite difficult for people to understand some aspects of Prague, the terminology, although it's not too bad. And also remember that most people who are using Prague, I mean, making decisions, the decision makers in the delegation or in Brussels, they also struggle with the language. I've never met anybody who can be so confident that they understand every single item in Prague. There's always some difference of opinion, and sometimes it's just related to the language, the way something is expressed in the guidelines. So as I mentioned, that Chapter 5 of Prague is related to the grant contract, and your grant contract comes from Prague, the makeup of it. And again, this is very obvious, but for organizations that you are trying to support, you have to make it very clear to them that the contract is really quite a comprehensive document. Okay? And it's not just the top couple of pages, which is the special conditions. There are all these annexes. And, well, it was interesting to hear yesterday that you mentioned that you get even legal advice on looking at the contract. But organizations have to be really aware what they are signing up to. And you should point this out, that there are all these different annexes, and particularly the general conditions to go through that. Okay, let me ask you, in terms of, for you and your organisations, when you get an EU grant and there's monitoring from the grant, who is monitoring your project? Okay, so we have actually there probably should be 3 different stakeholder groups here. There are often technical assistance teams who are contracted through a service contract to do the monitoring. Secondly, there is the contracting authority. So in most of your cases that is the EC, but in Turkey, Croatia, Macedonia it's a CSCU or the equivalent who will be monitoring the contract. But thirdly, if you are under decentralized system, the delegation may also monitor as observers. So for those countries you might have 3 different types of people interested in your project to monitor it. Now for most of you, if the people who are coming to visit you are technical assistance teams, so they are consultants who are under a contract, they're providing a service to the contracting authority or to the beneficiary institution. So, but I think just to be clear on this, the monitoring of a project is done, it's for management purposes. It's to make sure that the project is successful and that the money is spent in the correct way. So monitoring is in 2 ways. It's compliance. Monitoring that you're complying with your contract. But secondly, it's monitoring against the results. It's result-orientated monitoring. And both sides is all about making sure that that money, the award of the grant, is going to be done, is going to achieve the purpose for which it was given, and the money is spent in the correct way. So anyone who's involved in monitoring, if they're a technical assistance team, if it's the delegation or a contracting authority, their attitude should be that they're there to help you. And I know that that is often not the case, sadly, but you should do everything that you can to try to lobby for that change of attitude, that they are there to help. And you should ask them questions. I think often monitors themselves are not always so competent and comfortable, and they feel challenged, and they don't know quite what to say to you. So this can be an issue, but I think you always need to try to ask them, encourage them to speak to you, to give advice. I think particularly when it's technical assistance teams, because these are external contractors, people whose job they've been recruited because they have some expertise. And it's there not only just to do the compliance and to report to the contracting authority, but to help you or whoever the grant beneficiary is that your project is successful. So I would say always ask. Don't let a monitoring visit go on without you getting something out of it. You know, ask them. If you don't understand procurement aspects, get them to explain to you what you need to do. Or if there's some other technical areas of project management, ask. They might not be able to give you an answer, but ask them. So, okay, if you don't know, but what I would strongly encourage you to do, despite this last comment, is that you have great field experience of managing grant projects. And there are lots of occasions where people talk about these issues, like things you should do or things you shouldn't do, and often it gets undocumented. It's just in your head, it's your experience. So what I would recommend that you do in your organizations, maybe some of you have already done it, is just to write down your simple hints of how you manage an EU grant contract. Just the simple things that you do, you should do, or take note of, or things that not to do. Of course, you can do technical trainings on the contract and go through the whole contract and look at Prague, etc. But just having a whole list, a checklist of practical items from you as practitioners, I think is extremely useful. So I don't know in your organizations whether you have mechanisms for institutional learning, to capture lessons learned, this kind of things. Do you, in your organizations, have any of these kinds of mechanisms? When you finish a project, what do you do? Just move on to the next one? Or, I mean, how do you capture lessons learned from the management of the project? Because a lot of, when you sign your contract to get the EU grant, Very often it's very much down to the personal relationships, the project manager, the coordinator managing the project, and the person in the contracting authority that you deal with, and the people who come and monitor the project. And often you have discussions and there are issues, but then when the project is finished and those people go off and do different things, the learning from that experience of how you manage the contract goes away. So all these simple do's and don'ts often can get lost. They're not written down. And maybe some of them are very obvious to you, if you're experienced, but to an organisation who's having its first EU grant, they go through all kinds of pain to manage the grant. And if, from experienced people, if you're able to have some good little practical advice, I think it's a good thing to do. But doing a simple exercise of what did we learn from managing a contract, do's and don'ts, you know, let's face it, it takes an hour of time, and you just write down some notes. It's not a difficult thing to do. And you just capture it within the organisation. So that if the one person who's really experienced in managing EU funds goes away, at least the institution still has this little list, you know, and it's a good thing to do. So I say, this is my advice to you in terms of how you support others. Because we have all of these documents like PRAV and the contracts, but it's good that you somehow are able to document and use your day-to-day practical experience, because this is the most useful thing to do. Okay, I'm going to go through, just to kind of wrap this up, contract stuff up, I have a few slides on it, and then I want to talk a little bit about procurement. You also stress that it's a contracted procedure. There are contracts and there's all these conditions. So organisations should not enter into the process without seriously thinking about the responsibilities that they're taking on and what you can do and what you can't do once you've been awarded the contract. You should make these things clear. A lot of the issues which come up during implementation, sometimes organisations do get advice through a training programme or something at the beginning of the project. And some of these issues are warned then. But even though you may not have directly been awarded a grant, generally if you're providing training to CSOs on managing EU funds, I think it's good to flag up some issues here. And for me there are three key aspects to this, three key things that I think always you should warn organisations about. One is that the contract is not always easy to change. It can be a very difficult, a very frustrating, time-consuming, painful process. So they need to be aware of all of the conditions and what can and cannot be changed in the contract. We'll look at that in a minute. Secondly, organisations that are going to be involved in doing any kind of procurement, services, goods, whatever it is, if it's going to be more than 10,000 euros, they really need to be extra careful, okay, and pay attention to the whole of the process and refer to their implementation manual or to PRAV. And we're going to look at that issue in a minute. And lastly, because CSOs often don't have big structures, so it's quite difficult to administer all the bits of paper. If you have lots of staff and lots of people to organise these things, it often is a struggle. As I said earlier, CSOs are not set up to manage public funds. You do other things. So the pressure of managing an EU grant with all the administration